at 3:42 a.m. Moscow time this morning, satellite surveillance operators monitoring the Black Sea registered something that senior NATO intelligence officials are calling the most significant naval development in the region since the start of the Ukraine conflict. Russia's Black Sea Fleet, which has maintained continuous presence in its primary operating areas for 847 consecutive days, has disappeared from its established patrol zones. What happened next represents a fundamental shift in the strategic calculus governing European security architecture. The Black Sea Fleet is not merely a collection of warships. It represents Russia's primary power projection capability in a body of water through which approximately 2 million barrels of oil transit daily, where undersea infrastructure carries 68% of Europe's natural gas from Azerbaijan, and where grain exports feeding 47 nations flow through Ukrainian ports operating under the Black Sea Grain Initiative. When a fleet of this strategic significance vanishes from its operational pattern without explanation, the implications extend far beyond regional naval maneuvering. For the past 14 months, Russia has maintained what military analysts describe as a defensive posture, keeping major surface combatants at safe distance from Ukrainian coastal defenses, while prosecuting the maritime blockade through submarine operations, mine warfare, and long-range strike capabilities. That pattern held consistent through 847 consecutive days of operations, until 3:42 this morning, when commercial satellite imagery revealed that major Russian naval assets had withdrawn from their established positions south of Crimea, west of Novorossiysk, and throughout the traditional patrol zones the fleet has occupied since February 2022. Within 6 hours of that initial observation, NATO forces initiated what defense officials are describing as the most extensive intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operation conducted in European waters since the Cold War. What NATO discovered during those operations, what Russian forces are attempting to achieve through this withdrawal, and what happens next will determine whether the Black Sea becomes the flashpoint for direct confrontation between nuclear powers, or whether Moscow is executing a strategic retreat that signals fundamental reassessment of its position in the conflict. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because what is developing in the Black Sea at this moment is moving faster than any traditional news cycle can track, and the next 48 hours will reveal whether we are witnessing tactical repositioning or the opening moves of something far more consequential. The timeline of disappearance reveals coordination that suggests weeks of planning rather than emergency response to immediate threat. At 3:42 a.m. Moscow time, Planet Labs satellite constellation captured imagery showing the absence of major surface combatants from patrol zones south of Sevastopol. At 4:17 a.m., synthetic aperture radar satellites operated by European Space Agency partners confirmed that missile corvettes previously stationed west of Crimea had departed those positions. At 5:03 a.m., commercial shipping traffic monitoring systems registered the absence of electronic emissions from Russian naval vessels that had maintained continuous presence in international waters north of Turkish territorial boundaries. By 6:30 a.m., NATO maritime patrol aircraft operating from Romanian airbases had conducted reconnaissance flights covering 127,000 square nautical miles of Black Sea surface area. Those flights identified 7 Russian naval vessels in total, compared to the 23 major combatants, auxiliaries, and patrol craft that had occupied the region 72 hours earlier. 16 ships representing approximately $7 billion in replacement value and carrying an estimated 840 caliber cruise missiles in their vertical launch systems had withdrawn from operational areas. The vessels missing from their standard positions include 3 improved Kilo-class submarines, 4 Buyanem-class corvettes, 2 Admiral Grigorovich-class frigates, and 7 auxiliary vessels ranging from intelligence collection ships to fleet replenishment tankers. This represents the core combat power of the Black Sea Fleet, the platforms responsible for launching the majority of cruise missile strikes against Ukrainian infrastructure over the past 14 months. Where those vessels have gone becomes the critical intelligence question that NATO surveillance assets are working to answer. The Black Sea offers limited options for concealing a fleet of this size. Russian naval facilities exist at Novorossiysk, Sevastopol, and several smaller ports along the eastern coastline. Satellite surveillance of those facilities conducted between 7 a.m. and 11 a.m. Moscow time revealed elevated activity at Novorossiysk, where pierside berthing showed increased density compared to imagery from 48 hours prior. But the mathematics of displacement tells a revealing story. Novorossiysk harbor facilities can accommodate approximately 12 major combatants simultaneously without creating operational congestion that would impair normal fleet support activities. Even accounting for vessels undergoing maintenance, logistics operations, and crew rest cycles, the simultaneous return of 16 ships to port facilities creates density that naval architects describe as operationally inefficient and tactically vulnerable. Russian naval doctrine, developed through decades of Cold War experience and refined through observation of American carrier operations, emphasizes distribution of assets to prevent concentration of high-value targets in locations vulnerable to precision strike. Concentrating the entire operational Black Sea fleet in a single port facility violates that doctrine so fundamentally that NATO analysts are considering two primary explanations. The first explanation centers on threat assessment. If Russian intelligence has detected preparation for strike operations targeting fleet assets at sea, consolidating forces within the air defense umbrella, protecting Novorossiysk and Sevastopol, makes tactical sense despite the concentration risk. The second explanation involves strategic repositioning for offensive operations, requiring fleet consolidation before execution. Understanding which explanation matches reality requires examining what NATO forces did in the 6 hours following the initial observation of fleet withdrawal. That response reveals coordination between alliance members that intelligence officials describe as the most seamless integration of multinational reconnaissance assets since the 1999 Kosovo air campaign. At 9:47 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, a United States Navy P-8A Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft departed Naval Air Station Sigonella in Sicily, crossing into Romanian airspace at 11:23 a.m. before beginning reconnaissance operations over international waters in the western Black Sea. The P-8A carries the AN/APY-10 radar system capable of detecting surface vessels at ranges exceeding 200 nautical miles, along with magnetic anomaly detection equipment that can identify submerged submarines through variations in Earth's magnetic field caused by large metal objects. Simultaneously, Turkish naval forces increased patrol activity along approaches to the Bosphorus Strait, the 19-mile waterway that represents the only connection between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Under the 1936 Montreux Convention, Turkey maintains authority to regulate naval traffic through the strait, and Ankara has used that authority since February 2022 to prevent additional Russian warships from entering the Black Sea, while theoretically allowing vessels based in the Black Sea to transit to Mediterranean waters. The Turkish deployment placed surveillance assets in position to observe whether Russian vessels were attempting to exit the Black Sea entirely, potentially relocating to Mediterranean bases to escape perceived threat in their home waters. But as of 6 a.m. Moscow time today, no Russian major combatants have requested passage through the Bosphorus, and Turkish naval observers report no unusual activity suggesting preparation for such transit. The absence of Bosphorus transit requests eliminates one potential explanation for the fleet withdrawal, narrowing the range of Russian intentions, while raising questions about what alternative objective justifies concentrating major naval assets in port facilities. Here is what you are not being told in mainstream coverage of this development. The timing of the Russian withdrawal corresponds with a 96-hour window during which NATO intelligence satellites experienced scheduled maintenance that created temporary gaps in continuous coverage of Black Sea naval operations. Russian operational security would naturally exploit such gaps to execute movements they prefer to conduct without real-time observation. But the movements were detected anyway, through commercial satellite constellations and maritime patrol aircraft that maintain surveillance independent of classified intelligence systems. This suggests either that Russian planners underestimated the comprehensive nature of Western surveillance architecture, or that concealment was not the primary objective of the withdrawal. If Moscow intended the withdrawal to be observed, that observation itself becomes a signal requiring interpretation. Military signaling theory holds that actions intended to communicate strategic messages must be costly to execute. Otherwise, they carry no credible information about intentions or capabilities. Withdrawing an entire fleet from operational positions, concentrating assets in vulnerable port facilities, and creating temporary vacuum in contested waters represents costly action that suggests serious intent behind the signal. What message is Russia attempting to send through fleet withdrawal? Three possibilities emerged from NATO analysis of Russian strategic communications over the past 72 hours. The first possibility involves preparation for escalation. Concentrating fleet assets in defended ports while maintaining submarine presence in operational areas could precede large-scale cruise missile operations that would expose surface vessels to heightened counterfire risk. Withdrawing those vessels to safety before launching strikes protects high-value platforms while maintaining offensive capability through submarine-launched weapons. The second possibility centers on de-escalation signaling. International pressure on Russia to cease attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure has intensified following strikes that damaged grain export facilities and endangered the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Withdrawing the visible symbols of naval power that conduct those strikes could represent Moscow's response to diplomatic pressure, demonstrating restraint while maintaining capability and reserve. The third possibility involves neither escalation nor de-escalation, but rather operational necessity. Naval vessels require periodic maintenance, crew rotation, and logistics support that become increasingly difficult to provide during extended deployments in contested waters. After 847 consecutive days of high operational tempo, the Black Sea Fleet may be experiencing material degradation that requires sustained port time to address before systems failures compromise combat readiness. Determining which explanation matches reality requires examining what NATO did next, because the alliance response to Russian fleet withdrawal reveals Western assessment of Moscow's intentions through actions rather than statements. At 2:15 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, the United States European Command elevated the readiness status of rapid response forces assigned to NATO's enhanced forward presence in Romania and Bulgaria. This readiness elevation does not constitute deployment or mobilization, but rather shortens the timeline required to activate and deploy forces should that decision be made. Simultaneously, the United States Navy redirected the Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer USS Porter, which had been conducting routine operations in the eastern Mediterranean, to waters approaching the Bosphorus Strait. The Porter carries the Aegis combat system capable of tracking and engaging hundreds of targets simultaneously, along with 90 vertical launch cells loaded with Tomahawk cruise missiles, standard surface-to-air missiles, and ASROC anti-submarine weapons. The Porter's repositioning places American precision strike capability within range of Russian Black Sea facilities while maintaining the destroyer in international waters where its presence cannot be challenged under international law. This represents classic naval signaling, positioning capability without commitment while communicating that options remain available should circumstances require their exercise. But here is where NATO's response reveals something that fundamentally changes the strategic calculation. At 3:47 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, Royal Air Force reconnaissance aircraft operating from bases in Cyprus initiated what British Ministry of Defense officials describe as enhanced surveillance of Russian military installations along the Black Sea coast. Those aircraft carry signals intelligence packages that can intercept communications, radar emissions, and electronic warfare systems operating at Russian facilities. The significance of British involvement extends beyond simple alliance coordination. The United Kingdom has provided Ukraine with Storm Shadow cruise missiles capable of striking targets 150 miles inside Russian-controlled territory. And British intelligence sharing with Ukrainian forces has enabled some of the most effective targeting operations conducted during the conflict. Deploying British reconnaissance assets to monitor Russian Black Sea facilities while the fleet is concentrated in port creates intelligence picture that could enable targeting decisions should political leadership authorize such operations. Make sure you are subscribed to this channel and notifications are turned on, because what develops over the next 48 hours will determine whether the Black Sea Fleet withdrawal represents temporary tactical adjustment or the opening phase of a crisis that could force NATO to make decisions about direct involvement in the conflict. The next update on this situation is critical, and you cannot afford to miss it. The economic implications of Black Sea Fleet withdrawal extend far beyond immediate military considerations. The fleet's presence has maintained what economists describe as a risk premium on maritime insurance for vessels operating in the region, increasing shipping costs by an average of $127,000 per vessel per voyage compared to pre-conflict rates. That premium directly affects the cost of grain exports from Ukraine, fertilizer shipments from Russia, and oil transit from Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. If fleet withdrawal signals reduced threat to commercial shipping, insurance markets could respond by lowering premiums, immediately decreasing costs for agricultural exports that feed nations throughout Africa and the Middle East. Wheat prices on international commodity markets have decreased by 4 3% since this morning's reports of fleet withdrawal began circulating, representing approximately $18 per metric ton reduction that translates to meaningful savings for food importing nations operating on narrow budgets. But if the withdrawal proves temporary or represents preparation for escalation rather than de-escalation, the economic consequences move in the opposite direction. Insurance markets that reduce premiums based on perceived decreased risk would rapidly reverse those reductions if Russian naval operations resume at higher intensity. The resulting volatility creates uncertainty that shipping companies manage by avoiding the region entirely, which would further constrain Ukrainian export capacity and tighten global grain supplies. The grain export question matters enormously for global food security. Ukraine's grain exports feed approximately 400 million people worldwide, with particularly heavy reliance in Egypt, Lebanon, Tunisia, Yemen, and Libya. Disruption to those exports contributed to food price inflation that helped trigger political instability in several African nations over the past 18 months. Sustained disruption creates humanitarian crisis that generates refugee flows, political upheaval, and security challenges extending far beyond the Black Sea region. Russian decision-making regarding Black Sea fleet deployment must consider these global economic implications alongside purely military factors. Moscow gains leverage over European energy security through natural gas pipelines and oil exports, but Russia also depends on maritime access for its own agricultural exports, fertilizer shipments, and manufactured goods transit. Escalation that closes the Black Sea to commercial shipping imposes costs on Russian economy that already faces severe pressure from sanctions and military expenditure. The economic calculation creates incentive structure that favors de-escalation, suggesting the fleet withdrawal might represent genuine attempt to reduce tensions and preserve commercial maritime access that benefits all regional actors. But incentive structures describe what rational actors should do, not what they actually do. And Russian decision-making throughout this conflict has repeatedly prioritized political and military objectives over economic optimization. Understanding Russian intentions requires examining the internal political dynamics that shape naval deployment decisions. The Black Sea Fleet operates under command of the Russian Navy, which reports to the Ministry of Defense, which answers to President Vladimir Putin through the Security Council of the Russian Federation. But that formal command structure oversimplifies a decision-making process influenced by competing factions within Russian leadership. The Ministry of Defense, currently led by Andrei Belousov, following the dismissal of Sergei Shoigu in May 2024, has advocated for what military planners describe as operational pause to rebuild forces depleted by 14 months of high-intensity conflict. Belousov lacks the military background of his predecessor, coming instead from economic administration, and his appointment suggests Putin's desire to bring economic considerations into military planning that previously prioritized tactical objectives without adequate attention to sustainability. If Belousov's influence is growing within Russian decision-making, fleet withdrawal to port facilities for maintenance and reconstitution aligns with the operational pause strategy he has reportedly advocated. This interpretation suggests the withdrawal represents neither escalation nor de-escalation signaling, but rather practical necessity driven by material constraints that can no longer be ignored. But competing factions within Russian leadership reject operational pause arguments, particularly elements within the Federal Security Service and the Wagner Group successor organizations that maintain influence despite Yevgeny Prigozhin's death. These factions argue that pause signals weakness that Ukraine and NATO will exploit, and they advocate for sustained offensive operations that demonstrate Russian resolve regardless of economic costs. The tension between these factions plays out in Russian military operations, where strategic coherence sometimes gives way to seemingly contradictory tactical decisions driven by competing institutional interests rather than unified command intent. The Black Sea Fleet withdrawal could represent victory for the operational pause faction, or it could represent preparation for the kind of escalated operations that hardline factions demand. Determining which faction currently holds influence requires examining broader patterns in Russian military operations beyond just naval deployments. Over the past 72 hours, Russian ground forces have decreased artillery fire rates along the Zaporizhzhia front by approximately 23% compared to the previous week's average, suggesting possible ammunition conservation that would align with operational pause strategy. Simultaneously, missile strikes against Ukrainian energy infrastructure have continued at rates consistent with previous weeks, suggesting no overall de-escalation in the campaign. This mixed pattern makes interpretation difficult, but it suggests that different operational domains may be responding to different strategic guidance influenced by different factions within Russian leadership. Naval operations might be experiencing the operational pause that Belousov advocates, while ground operations continue under existing guidance. This fragmented approach creates operational incoherence, but reflects the reality of decision-making within authoritarian systems, where competing power centers vie for influence. What NATO did in response to this complex and ambiguous situation reveals Western assessment of the most likely Russian trajectory. At 5:33 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg convened an emergency meeting of the North Atlantic Council, the alliance's principal decision-making body, to assess the implications of Black Sea Fleet withdrawal and coordinate member state responses. The decision to convene the North Atlantic Council, rather than handling the situation through routine military coordination channels, signals that NATO leadership views the development as potentially significant enough to require political guidance rather than leaving response decisions to military commanders. This escalation to political level suggests concern that Russian actions may be leading toward crisis, requiring decisions about alliance military posture. Following the North Atlantic Council meeting, which concluded at 7:15 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, NATO issued a statement describing the alliance as closely monitoring Russian naval movements in the Black Sea and affirming commitment to supporting regional security and stability. The statement's carefully calibrated language avoids characterizing Russian actions as either threatening or reassuring, maintaining ambiguity that preserves NATO flexibility to respond to whatever develops next. But the real NATO response appears not in public statements, but in classified deployments that have been reported through Defense Ministry sources in member states. According to reporting from multiple European defense journalists citing unnamed officials, NATO has activated what are described as contingency plans for rapid reinforcement of Black Sea littoral allies should Russian actions require enhanced presence. These contingency plans, developed over the past 18 months as the conflict demonstrated Russia's willingness to accept military risk in pursuit of political objectives, involve deployment of additional NATO air and naval assets to Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey. The plans include positioning of Patriot air defense batteries, deployment of F-35 stealth fighters to Romanian air bases, and increased NATO maritime patrol activity throughout the Black Sea. Activation of contingency plans does not constitute implementation, but it shortens the timeline required to execute deployment should political leadership make that decision. This represents NATO hedging against the possibility that Russian fleet withdrawal precedes escalation rather than signaling de-escalation, preparing capability to respond rapidly while hoping that response proves unnecessary. The next critical indicator arrives within 24 to 48 hours, when satellite surveillance will reveal whether Russian naval vessels begin returning to operational areas or whether they remain concentrated in port facilities. If vessels begin dispersing back to patrol zones within that time frame, the withdrawal likely represents temporary tactical adjustment for logistics and maintenance rather than preparation for major operations. If vessels remain in port beyond 72 hours, NATO planning assumptions will shift toward the possibility of imminent escalation. Historical precedent provides some guidance for interpreting current events, though the uniqueness of each crisis limits the applicability of historical comparison. In April 1988, the Soviet Black Sea Fleet withdrew temporarily to port facilities during a period of heightened tensions with the United States following a collision between Soviet and American warships in the region. That withdrawal preceded diplomatic negotiations that de-escalated the immediate crisis while establishing protocols for future encounters. But historical precedent also includes the opposite pattern. In October 1973, the Soviet Mediterranean Squadron withdrew from advanced positions in the hours before the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War, concentrating forces in defended waters before the crisis escalated. That withdrawal signaled Soviet awareness of imminent conflict and desire to protect naval assets during the initial phase of hostilities. The contradictory historical precedents illustrate the fundamental challenge of strategic interpretation. Actions that appear similar can reflect entirely different intentions depending on context that is often not fully visible to outside observers. NATO analysis must account for multiple possible explanations simultaneously, preparing responses across the spectrum from de-escalation to crisis, while maintaining flexibility to adjust as additional information becomes available. What makes the current situation particularly challenging is the speed at which it has developed, combined with the high stakes involved. The Black Sea remains the only major body of water where NATO and Russian naval forces operate in close proximity without established protocols for preventing incidents from escalating into direct confrontation. The absence of those protocols, combined with the intensity of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the presence of sophisticated weapon systems on all sides, creates conditions where miscalculation or accident could produce consequences far beyond the immediate Black Sea region. The nuclear dimension cannot be ignored in any analysis of potential NATO-Russia confrontation. Russia maintains tactical nuclear weapons deployed with Black Sea Fleet vessels and at facilities throughout the region. NATO has repeatedly stated that any Russian use of nuclear weapons would produce response that fundamentally alters the character of the conflict. But the alliance has deliberately maintained ambiguity about what form that response would take. This nuclear ambiguity serves deterrent purposes by preventing Russia from calculating with confidence what consequences would follow from nuclear use. But it also creates uncertainty for NATO planners about what responses would be available should deterrence fail. The presence of nuclear weapons throughout the Black Sea region means that any significant military confrontation carries risk of escalation beyond conventional conflict. The Ukrainian perspective on Black Sea Fleet withdrawal deserves examination, as Kyiv's assessment and response will significantly influence how the situation develops. Ukrainian military intelligence, which has demonstrated sophisticated capability to track Russian naval movements and strike Russian vessels at sea, likely detected the fleet withdrawal simultaneously with NATO surveillance assets.